Hey everybody, really quickly before we get into today's episode, I just got a couple of things I need to run by you. First and foremost, I finally have my website up. Been talking about it for a while and it's taken a little bit longer than necessary, but I think it was well worth the wait. Basically, you'll be able to submit your own stories there. You can buy obviously all the merch and stuff that I have going on, as well as finding like all the links to everything, as well as my socials like YouTube. Obviously, we'll probably already be on YouTube at this point, and then your wherever you listen to podcasts at, if you listen to this on podcast form or whatever, you can find all that stuff there. I'm planning on dropping more merch and stickers and posters and shirts and stuff as well. I'm thinking about like a crew neck or something for the Halloween and spooky season, so be on the look for that. Hopefully I'm gonna have that drop September, between September and October, sometime around there. But feel free, mean the world to me, to support me even more by buying some merch. If you do so, please tag me in it on your social. I'd love to see that, whatever the case may be, or don't feel obligated to do so whatsoever, but the option is there if you want to. I think there's some pretty sweet stuff on there, especially I really am very stoked with how the posters came out. And I've got some really dope ideas for the Halloween drop as well, for more posters, stickers, and merch as well. So yeah, be on the lookout again for that. And please go check it out. Tell me what you think. And also, if you do buy like anything on there, shirts, stickers, whatever, there is a limit. So like I only have X amount of each of them, but I didn't really know, again, like how many to buy, because I don't really know who's going to be genuinely and seriously interested in that. So, or if you buy something and it's out of stock, well, I can very easily get more stock of whatever that item is. I just didn't know exactly how many to buy. I didn't want to overbuy and have a shitload of merch just sitting and never get sold. So those, if it's out of stock, it might take, another week more, maybe 2 weeks tops more to actually get to you, but you will get it. It just might take a little bit longer than you'd want it to, or I'd want it to, but yeah. All right, and the second and final thing, which is just as important, is Zach, the guy who helps me out with each of these episodes and finds all the stories for me. I've kind of, beat a dead horse with this, telling you what he does behind the scenes, but he's a giant help and a very good writer and a very cool dude. A bunch of indie authors, horror authors like himself, I'll use this website called BookFunnel, and a BookFunnel is a place where people can download books in exchange for their email. That's literally it. They don't have to pay anything. There's no catch. There's no I gotchas. And all the participating authors are given their own unique link to use. So for the entire month of August, you can download over 20 indie horror titles totally for free. No gimmick, just simply put in your email address and get some of the best books in horror, all for free. Zach is an award-winning horror author. You can find his debut anthology as well as a preview of his upcoming release, Ghosts of Gravesmith, all in the Summer of Horror book promo. All you have to do is simply press that link and reap the gifts provided. Ghosts of Gravesmith is like a Lovecraftian horror story, and Zach had just finished writing it. He's getting ready to release the advanced reader copy, as well as a one-of-a-kind collector's edition, through his Facebook page and his Patreon. So be on the lookout for further updates. I'll obviously update you guys along the way when the updates are available. I will also be leaving the Summer of Horror book promo in a pinned comment and in the description as well. So please go check out my website, buy some merch if you want to, and please go check out the Summer of Horror book promos. All you got to do is put your email again. All you got to do is put your email in. Good Lord, I can't talk right now. And you're going to reap all these rewards and get all these books for free. It's a no-brainer, guys. I know this is a very long-winded, long intro. So if you made it this far, I appreciate you still listening. And let's get into the stories today. Okay. I grew up as a bit of a nerdy kid. I loved to read. The Boxcar Children, Hardy Boys, and all those other latchkey kid mystery stories. They would spark a curiosity in me from a young age, wherein I wanted to explore all the time. It started out with just deep parts of the attic and garage, and by the time I was in high school, I was letting myself into abandoned houses around town, seeing what there was to see. I used to be obsessed with mysteries, the thrill of finding something unknown, something buried just beneath the surface of our mundane lives. Those were the days that I lived for, and it all started with those silly books that I read as a kid. My friends often called me crazy, but to me, urban exploration wasn't just a hobby, it was an addiction. I can still remember the exact moment it would change my life forever. Do I regret it? No, but I don't like Urbex as much as I used to. It was a cool October evening when I first heard about the old farming facility on the edge of my town. It came at the perfect time that I was looking for a new place to check out too. It was just one of those passing comments from a guy at school. You know the type, shrouded in that air of self-important mystery. Like he knew this secret that he wasn't quite ready to share. He was talking to somebody in the library. I stood just one shelf over and listened in. He mentioned the abandoned farm, a place nobody had talked about for years. Naturally, my curiosity piqued. I was on my way to check it out. I literally left campus that moment. The place was supposed to be near the library at the end of town. Our main street went so long that it dead ends at a bypass bridge for the local interstate. I remember driving out there, seeing the large rusting fence that marked the boundary of the facility. Sure enough, it was across the lot from the old brick library. The fence was bent and battered, a large hole where somebody had snipped through the wire. Right there, I planned my return. I'd slip through that gap inside the fence, use the overgrown bushes to sneak onto the property, and see what's up after that. My gear was minimal, a flashlight, a few tools, a ski mask, and it was enough to get me started. When I arrived at the farm the following night, darkness seemed to be thicker here, like it had its own density. Honestly, I'd love the eeriness to many of these places. I would have given anything back then for an opportunity to explore an asylum or something similar. But still, in the moment, this would have to do. The moonlight cast long shadows across the crumbling concrete. The wind taunted me through the ruins. I found my way through that hole in the fence and began to explore. There wasn't really much at first, and I didn't use my flashlight yet, just in case there were people around. It was very possible the place wasn't abandoned and maybe had some kind of overnight security. The facility was vast, though, sprawling in a way that spoke of a past grandeur. It reminded me of a small city, the Vatican or something. Chutes and trowels now rustled overgrown, and they scattered about. It started to give the place identity. It really was a farm. The pens were empty, save for the occasional stray cat that darted across my path. I saw some more chutes, and it dawned on me then. This was a massive pig farm, the likes of which had never existed in our town. Why had nobody ever mentioned this place to me before? I've lived here literally my whole life, and there was zero local history about a pig farmer. For some reason, thinking about that creeped me out, like there was some form of conspiracy at play. As I wandered deeper, the farm revealed itself as a ghost of its former self. Everything was old as shit, rusted, trash everywhere. The buildings were dilapidated, the windows shattered and boarded up. There definitely wasn't anybody out here. Inside one of the barns, I found remnants of human activity though. Graffiti splattered across the walls, darts embedded in one of the old wooden boards, a collection of empty beer bottles. There was even a pile of golf balls and a golf club, which seemed kind of oddly out of place. It was all in one corner, on a table, and there was what seemed to be a pile of homework dated 1983, all with the same first and last name in the top right corner. Super weird. I entered one of the big stall buildings, where I think the pigs slept. It smelled awful. There was mouse and bat poop almost up to my ankles. There, I stumbled upon a sleeping bag. It was small, very used and dirty. It was surrounded by scattered toys, stuffed animals, and a few worn-out books. There's a few nubs of crayons laying together in this small pile. was about to inspect the area more closely when I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be doing that." I froze. This was not something I was ever prepared for. The voice was soft, young, and tinged with this accent that I couldn't place. That in itself gave me a little confidence, but still, there was something strange behind me. Slowly, I turned around, and there, emerging from the shadows, was a child. It could have been no more than 6 years old. What the hell? My heart raced. This was definitely not part of the exploration that I had planned for today. This wasn't part of anybody's plan. I forced a smile. "Hey there, do you live here?" The child nodded. Yes. He looked up at me with these wide, curious eyes, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver of guilt. It was so small and dirty, bright blue eyes, these little fingers. This truly was a little kid. The hell was he doing in here? It's unsettling to see a kid in living such a place. Do your parents live here too?" The child's expression shifted, his eyes becoming distant. Not a good sign. "They come and go," he said, his voice trailing off. He took a couple of quick glances over his shoulder. The whole visual was very unsettling. Before I could ask more, the child scampered off, led me through the farm. I didn't know what else to do but just follow him, assuming whoever else lived here with him was not around. He pointed out old pig pens and saw where the animals used to sleep, now just empty spaces of overgrown with weeds. There were still these huge bags of animal feed around, the corners gnawed through from mice and rats. He mentioned that stray dogs and cats, sometimes even packs of coyotes, came into the farm. He slept in the biggest, smelliest building because the animals didn't like to go in there. My unease grew with every single step. I was constantly expecting something to lurch out from every corner. The child's nonchalance about their living condition was really disturbing. The thought of anybody, let alone a child, existing in such squalor made my skin crawl. Still, I paddled along behind him. I knew I had to do something to get this kid to safety. The authorities needed to know about it. There wouldn't be anybody else coming along to alert them either. The child led me to this dingy basement area. The walls were dirt streaked, the smell of mildew completely filling the air. It was even more putrid here than the stall building that I found that kid in. There was more recent evidence of people here though. Empty cans, discarded clothing, and a few makeshift beds. A pair of oily overalls hung from a clip on the wall. It all turned my stomach into a knot just to see it. The child looked up at me with this hopeful smile. "Would you like to meet my parents? I think they're home." He even reached out and squeezed my hand. You better believe I was shocked to see that he only had 4 fingers. The hell was all this? My stomach twisted into a snake pit. I could hear a strange sound, a tuneless hymn, sung with an eerie fever. To this day, it's the most ominous, unsettling sound that I've ever heard a human make, and it made my skin crawl. There wasn't anything natural about it, and I felt a cold sweat forming as that sound grew louder and more insistent. It was like a deaf person trying to sing. I think I need to go," I stammered out, and the kid let go of my hand. The child's face fell, but he didn't say anything. This was going to be my only chance, and even now, the singing was getting closer. I backed away, my eyes darting down the narrow, dirt-streaked hallway. A light came on way down the stretch, showing me how long the hallway actually was. I looked upward, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I turned to glance back. And that's when I saw him, a man at the bottom of the stairwell, glaring up at me with that look that could freeze blood. His eyes were hollow, dark, filled with this kind of malice that I'll never forget. I almost froze right there when I saw him. Instead, I bolted. The hell else was I gonna do? A sprinted through a maze of crumbling buildings, my heart pounding in my chest. I never turned around once, but I swear I could hear footsteps thumping right after me. The shadows seemed to close in. The hissing of the wind grew louder and more mocking. I scrambled through the hole in the fence and didn't stop running until I stumbled back into the parking lot of that old library. The buzzing lamppost gave me a sterile sense of safety. The next morning, I went straight to the police station and reported those squatters. I wanted to go that night, but I was exhausted. Just needed to be in the insecurity of my own house. I didn't know what else to do. That kid needed help though, so I went back first thing. They took my report and said they'd look into it. There had been other reports of weirdos coming and going from that property. By the end of that week, there was a newspaper article about a child being rescued from the abandoned farm. The story was brief, focusing solely on that child's rescue. Again, this gave me some sort of conspiratorial vibe, as there had been others in there with him. I know there was. But there was nothing else about those strange people living in that basement. Nothing about a woman singing or a big pair of overalls. No arrest, no descriptions, no follow-up. It was as if they vanished into thin air. It was unbelievable. But that kid was safe, and that was my sole intent. Still, the parents knew they'd been exposed and had fled, leaving behind the child as cover. That boy, whose name was Martin, got taken in, ward of the state type of thing, and still lives in the county. I personally don't see him or anything, but it was a case that I followed for quite some time. Nobody knows about what happened to his family or how long they lived inside that pig farm. Sometimes, I wonder if they're still out there, hiding in the dark corners of forgotten places, waiting for the next curious soul to wander way too close. God knows that was the kind of thing that I was looking for on my urban tours of the underbelly. The child was rescued, but the horrors that lurk in the shadows of our abandoned spaces, those, it seems, are never fully unearthed. Some to never see the light of day. I grew up in a rural crap town in North Texas. As a kid, there was a bit of urban decay around the town. I remember an old abandoned brick factory downtown, but nothing crazy interesting, I guess. There was, however, this huge abandoned structure on the outskirts of town. I grew up driving by it all the time, like anytime my family went out of the city or out of town for anything, I'd see it. It was just this weird piece of old life, an old abandoned building that wasn't even finished. Had ghostly empty windows and no doors on it. Well, as I got older, I got more curious. I learned more about it, and one day my buddy Ethan and I decided it was time to explore it. I remember the wind whispering a warning that night as we stood at the edge of that forsaken place. The abandoned condominium loomed before us, a decaying monolith of shattered dreams and forgotten lives. Ethan and I had grown up with tales of its grim history, a so-called failed investment, some shady dealings, rumors of weird cult-like activity going on within its walls. "You think we'll find anything?" Ethan's voice trembled, his flashlight casting these eerie shadows on the overgrown grass. We were so-called urban explorers, fueled by teenage curiosity and a dash of reckless decision-making. As our driver dropped us off, she did so with a smirk. She said she'd already explored this place with a few other seniors before, end to end, finding nothing scarier than some satanic graffiti. But Ethan and I wanted to see for ourselves. We were sophomores, she was a junior, and she could drive. So she agreed to drop us off and then pick us up 2 hours later. We watched as her brake lights disappeared down that winding off-shot dirt road that led back to town, and then she was gone. Tonight, we were on our own, I adjusted the strap of my backpack, the weight of the handheld tape recorder pressing against my spine. "Only one way to find out," I replied, my breath visible in the chill night air. "Let's capture this shit." I fished out my handheld camcorder out of my backpack, along with my own flashlight, and got myself together quickly. I wore a tight backpack and running shoes, so I could book it if need be. Kept simple stuff inside the bag: a spare battery for the camcorder, spare for the flashlight, some bolt cutters, a hatchet, and for whatever reason, a handful of M80s and a lighter. Just trying to be prepared for anything, you know? The building stood like this wounded beast, its windows shattered, its walls sagging. Graffiti adorned its surface, twisted symbols scrawled by hands that reveled in the darkness. Tiff had warned us about it, but we were undeterred. We'd seen worse in horror movies. This was almost just like a real-life set for our own twisted tales. She wasn't kidding, though. The poorly painted devilingo was everywhere. Layers of it seemed. And this was just the outside. We stepped through the loose chain-link fence, its rusted metal groaning in protest. The moon hung low, casting elongated shadows across the crackled pavement. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing more broken glass, some discarded beer cans, and remnants of teenage escapades. The air smelled of damp and decay, a cocktail of mildew and just forgotten secrets. The closer we got, the weirder the debris became. Discarded shoes, shredded books, a pile of used condoms. It was absolutely vile. "Remember, no paranormal crap," Ethan muttered, his eyes scanning the graffiti-covered walls. "Just real-life horror." "Well, there's your real-life horror," I said, pointing at the rotting latex. "One misstep and it's STD City." "Try to focus, dumbass," Ethan laughed. I nodded with my heart pounding. We were trespassing, but the thrill of the forbidden just pushed us forward. We followed the building's perimeter, seeking some kind of entrance. The windows were boarded up, the doors were sealed shut. But near the back, a gap, a jagged hole where plywood had given way. This was our portal into the abyss. I know I said nothing was finished, but because it was condemned, everything was plugged up with a stiff layer of plywood. I used my hatchet to open the hole just a little more, chipping away as quietly as I could. Ethan went in first, squeezed through the opening. I followed, my backpack catching on the splintered wood. Inside, the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. Our flashlight danced around peeling wallpaper, revealing faded floral patterns and stains that hinted at long-gone leaks. It was rank with mold and mildew, so we threw on those little masks that we carried for those gross explorations. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the walls held their own breath. I found myself wishing that we brought goggles, as the dust and debris inside the air was so thick that we kept getting stuff in our eyes. I think it was sawdust that we were disturbing, but I couldn't be quite sure. "You think there's anybody else in here?" Ethan whispered, his voice echoing down the narrow hallway. I shook my head. Tiff said it was empty, but who knows? Maybe the ghosts of bad investments linger on. We both laughed at that. We explored room by room, our footsteps muffled by the dust and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered around, toppled chair, a shattered mirror. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of crickets outside. We found remnants of lives once lived, a child's drawing on a crumbling wall, a forgotten shoe beneath a rotting bed frame. And then something occurred to me. This condo was never completed. What was all this live-in decor doing here? The more we explored on that first outer ring of rooms, the more evidence we'd find of squatters. And not just one or two, entire families it seemed. And it's been a considerable amount of time, at least from what it looked like. Aside from the little makeshift houses, there was endless streams of trash from parties, beer cans, shattered liquor bottles, graffiti, even some loose syringes. Then, randomly, we heard something that we couldn't really explain. Something like a cough in the walls, followed immediately by a person clearing their throat. All in all, it was probably only 5 seconds of audio, but it was enough to freeze us in place. We were curious about there being people inside. Now, we had our answer. "Did you hear that?" Ethan stammered out. I nodded with my skin prickling. "It's just the building settling," I lied. But we both knew better. As we followed the sounds deeper, it drew us towards this central staircase. The steps groaned underneath our weight, and as we climbed, the air thickened. Shadows danced along the walls, elongated figures that seemed to writhe and twist. The creaks grew louder, forming syllables, sentences. If there was anybody upstairs, they knew we were coming. I swear at one point we heard somebody holler out, "Fuck off," from much deeper in the building. But as we climbed, I recreated the layout in my mind. It seemed this building had 16 individual units, all connected internally with hallways and staircases. The structure was much bigger than we initially guessed, and now that we were so deep, it would take us a few minutes to navigate our way back. Each step took us further and further from safety. We pressed on though, driven by this morbid curiosity. There wasn't much to do, especially for kids with interests like Ethan and I. This is where we wanted to be, and what we wanted to do. The top floor revealed a gaping hole where the roof had caved in. Moonlight was spilling through, illuminating a room at the end of the hallway. We stepped inside, our flashlights flickering. And there, etched into the floorboards, were words, faint, desperate, and unmistakably human. "Time devours," Ethan read aloud. "The hell does that even mean?" I asked. We both shrugged, continued to search the room. Just a few steps in, and something knocked a sheet of plaster loose from the wall. It fell, cracked, and honestly scared the shit out of both of us. It wasn't the plaster moving that scared us, though. It was what we saw crawling through the wall behind it. It's a rat, a colossal one at that. I swear to God it was the size of a small dog, and from the nose to tail, it had to be 1.5 feet long. It scurried off into the darkness, careless of what it had done to the loose piece of drywall. Ethan's scream echoed throughout the empty halls. He didn't like anything that crawled. We both stumbled back, crashing into one another, our fear feeding the unseen presence. Tiff wouldn't be back for an hour, and even then we were stuck inside the building, trapped, ensnared by the very walls that we'd come in to explore. I swung my flashlight around and looked for any kind of quick exit. As we took in a few calming breaths, the sound of the animal dissipated. We sobered up and just got our shit together. We actually collapsed into the wall behind us, so now we were covered in ash and all kinds of other crap. We dusted ourselves off and took a second to look around the room again. Time Devourer stared back at us with this oddly menacing tone. There was other stuff painted on the walls, but those words were the one that stood out the most. The room that we were in now didn't seem lived in like many of the other rooms that we had encountered so far. If anything, this seemed like the room that rituals would go on in. It had that same look and feel as church. Weird little totems and items nailed to the walls. Weird creations made from sticks and leaves on the floor. The spooky words, just all of it. It was one of those things you'd have to see to really understand, though. "This room is creepy, man," I said. "Record it," Ethan replied. "All of it." I went through and took slow, sweeping shots of everything. When I got to where the roof was blasted open above me, I turned and recorded what I could see. Up above us, something weird jostled back and forth. It looked like a tarp or fabric of some kind, blowing loose in the breeze. That being said, it was so dark I couldn't really tell, and I didn't think to point my flashlight at it. My adrenaline was amped. I was so focused on recording everything in the moment. We left that ceremony room and went back the way we came, trying doors and looking for a way onto the roof. Another hall over, we found access through this maintenance door. A slender ladder went straight up about 10 feet where there was a hatch. Lots of names were written all over cinder blocks, along with dates and words of wisdom. Sally and Kenny, 1998. Lori loves Mike, 99. Call this number for a good time. Man who goes to bed with an itchy butt wakes up with a smelly finger. Classic high school graffiti, most of it in marker or chalk. Lots of cigarette butts rested at the bottom of the ladder, telling us kids would conglomerate on the roof to smoke cigarettes during their party, which implied some sense of safety. People had clearly been up here before. What we discovered was an unstable, incredibly dangerous field of pitfalls. No part of that roof was safe, but still we wanted to see what was around. The whole point of being out here. There were avenues along the rooftop that were clearly worn with use, so we did our best just to stick to those. But even then, some of them gave out on the slightest amount of weight on top of it. The whole pitch of the roof seemed to be at a slant, so not much was really actually up there. Some graffiti, but no actual artifacts, as whenever the wind blew, the tilted angle sent it all sailing to the ground or out into the woods. Just as we turned back to head for the hatch, something caught our eye. A pile of rags or trash along the lip of the roof. Only once Ethan hit it with his flashlight did we see boots jutting out from the bottom, beady little eyes staring back at us. It wasn't a pair of linens, but a man wearing a mountain of wasted clothing. His hair was filthy, sticking out from his head. His fingertips were black from rot or just stain. "Holy shit," I whispered. Oh my God. Ethan already sounded like he was expecting certain death. Before we could say anything else, the man simply stood to his full height. It was one swift motion, incredibly fast. The guy was very, very tall. Very skinny as well, so the entire movement was just unsettling. Watching it through the feed of my camcorder was even more terrifying. I looked over the edge of the camcorder. To my horror, found that man looking right back at me. His clothing seemed to be going haywire, shuffling in every direction. As we took careful steps backward, both away from the man and from the hatch, we saw what was making his clothing move. It was the huge rat that we saw earlier, crawling through the layers of clothing. It was this guy's pet, apparently, and pushed its head right next to his and swiveled to have a look at us now. It was all too much. Ethan started immediately barreling backwards, and after he took 8 or 9 steps, part of the roof collapsed and he disappeared right through the floor. I couldn't believe it, and in that moment, I was sure that he was dead. He crashed through at least 2 floors, and if not, he landed on something awful and would shatter his legs. All kinds of fucked up possibilities were running through my head. As they did, I heard that tall man behind me, taking steps to close in. I turned and found that he was only a couple of feet away from me, almost on top of me. The rat looked down from the hole it chewed through his collar and hissed. The man himself didn't really have any kind of expression, just these big white eyes that were bugging out of his head, this drooping frown. I couldn't tell how old he was, but with his movements closing in, I felt like he was going to try and pick me up. This made me so scared I thought I was going to vomit, so I did the only thing that really made sense. I ran for my life over to that hole in the floor, the collapsed ceiling that I'd been recording earlier. To my surprise, I actually made it across that quaking rooftop, with the tall man only a few steps behind. Ran until I reached that slanted hole into the floor below. In just a brief second that I stood there, my brain had put something together. You remember when you peered up this slant earlier? There's a big bag or linen blowing around up top. Whatever that was, should have been where I was standing. As I looked down to access my chances of making it to the bottom, there wasn't any fabric of any kind. Whatever tarp or bag that I perceived earlier was gone. I I realized the sound that I heard and the motion that I caught on the camcorder was that tall man behind me, scrambling up a collapsed slant to get away from Ethan and I. I collapsed to my bottom and slid down the incline. I started end over end about halfway down. My legs and hip caught a groove or something, just sent me flying. I crashed into the bottom, rolled into the corner, and found myself locked up and upside down. My back and shoulder were absolutely fucked. I was seeing static. It was gonna take me a minute to get upright. I blinked a couple of times, and what did I see? That tall man sneaking down that collapsed roof toward me with this practically predatory grace. For some reason in that moment, I realized that guy had never spoken a word to us, never issued a threat or warning. He just came right at us. Because of his silence, we didn't know what his intentions were. I scrambled to my feet and realized I was still holding that camcorder. When I looked down at it, I knew it was broken for sure. It smashed into the ground a couple of times during my tumble down that slant. I shook it free and dropped the whole unit, ran the best I could into darkness on that top floor level. I left the ceremony room again, turned a corner, and to my surprise, ran directly into Ethan. He was down the hall maybe 25 feet walking the other way. I bolted at him, but then realized my mistake. It was a person, but it wasn't Ethan. Whoever they were, they turned around and started running at me too. This was a true nightmare. Every joint, every muscle screamed as I turned around and dashed in the other direction again. I found the staircase that would take me to the ground floor. Decided, unfortunately, Ethan was on his own. I needed to get out with my battered arms and legs. I didn't think I was going to make it either. I hobbled as best as I could to freedom. I heard shuffling and footsteps below. I looked over the railing and there, I saw Ethan one floor below me, jumping down the stairs 3 at a time. Turned out he collapsed through the roof, laid there in a shock for a moment before doing the same thing I was doing, trying to make an escape.
"Hey, you asshole!"
I hollered over the banister. Ethan froze in place, turned to look up at me.
"Dude, come on!"
He yelled back.
"I can't, I'm all fucked up,"
I said, limping down the stairs. I could see the apprehension in his face, and to his credit, Ethan turned around and blasted back up to me. He threw an arm underneath mine and helped carry my crippled ass back down to the ground floor. As we scooted along, we filled each other in on what happened to one another. He fell and tried to escape. I got chased, slid down the roof into the second floor, and got chased some more. As we turned the corner on the second floor, just one flight of stairs away, we saw him standing there. Somehow, that other person that I'd seen upstairs had beat us down to the second floor. He wore these weird old Victorian clothes and had no shoes on. He paced back and forth between the two doors, staring at us. Then we heard a sound behind us at the top of the stairs. It was the tall man and his rat, sitting at his feet like this loyal dog. The creepiest shit I've ever seen, and frankly, I just couldn't believe it. Who's able to train a rat like that? They quickly began to descend the stairs, eyes still wide, white, and buggy. Ethan and I turned and bolted down that last staircase as quickly as we could. We turned and pulled an old pallet down that blocked our way, then went screaming for the door. We could hear all kinds of shit crawling around down there in the dark. Those creeps probably had secret passages between the floors, shortcuts that the average person wouldn't know about. We spilled out into the night, and to our surprise, saw headlights coming down the way. We almost screamed in victory when we saw it was Tiff's old beater sedan. Adrenaline took over and I spreaded myself over the fence, wiggled through the gap, and then yanked Ethan out behind me. He was zapped from carrying me for so long. We hopped in the car and told Tiff to punch it. She thought we were messing with her, but the more we told our story, she started to nod along. It was just too creepy. She asked some of her friends who went out there more often, but Nobody had ever encountered the creeps like that before. Obviously, they'd seen some big-ass rats, but none that were quote-unquote domesticated. The whole thing just felt like some kind of horror movie one-off. For obvious reasons, Ethan and I never went back to that abandoned condo. But I can tell you for a fact, it's still out there, and I know kids still venture into it. Sometimes I hear stories about their encounters, but I've never heard anything like what happened to us. I wasn't really a thrill seeker by nature, but when you're 15 and trying to catch the eye of a boy that you like, you do things you wouldn't normally do. The boy that I was crushing on was into all this edgy stuff, and Urban Expo was really all the rage that year. Everybody talked about sneaking into abandoned buildings and finding secrets buried inside the decay. Dylan, of course, was the mastermind behind half the excursions at our school. I didn't really understand the appeal at the time, but I wanted to get closer to the boy who'd been occupying my daydreams for months and months. So I decided to tag along on one of these nighttime escapades with him and our mutual friend Derek, Amber, and also Gary. Derek and Amber were dating. Gary was old enough to drive, so it was a perfect little crew. I'd heard the stories, of course, how these outings were a mix of adrenaline and danger, but I hadn't really grasped what that meant until that night. I didn't prepare at all. I was just simply along for the ride. And I remember meeting them at the park, my heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and dread. I was a bit out of place in my flip-flop sandals, shorts, and spaghetti straps, but I was determined. Gary's old sedan was our chariot, and as we drove towards the outskirts of town, I couldn't shake that feeling that something was going to go terribly wrong. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of damp earth. We turned on some music, and that did calm my nerves a little bit, as Dylan gave us the rundown about what to expect. The destination was an abandoned strip mall. It loomed in the darkness like a skeletal remnant of better days. Its boarded up windows and sagging roof, a sign of how bad the decay really was. I'd seen the place during the day, but never at night, and never this close. The rumor was, one of the back doors was always ajar, so the group was eager to see if we could slip inside and explore for ourselves. Gary parked the car and we huddled together, our breath forming clouds in the chilly night air. We took inventory of our meager equipment, then pressed on around the back of the building. Dylan looking more confident than anyone had a right to, and led the way. I followed, my flip-flops slapping against the pavement with every step, their casualness starkly contrasting the grim scene before us. Everybody else had on running shoes or boots, face coverings, flashlights. I literally didn't have anything, and it made me a little self-conscious. The door was indeed ajar. Dylan pushed it open and held it that way with a big grin. We slipped through and were immediately swallowed by the darkness. It was overwhelming, almost suffocating. The flashlight Dylan handed me barely cut through the gloom, revealing creepy graffiti that seemed to writhe on the walls as we passed it. There were remnants of small campfires, ashen remains of a testament to others who'd explored before us. Did they party out here, or was it hobos sleeping in the walls? I had all kinds of creepy crap running through my head. As we moved deeper inside the building, the eeriness of the place seemed to grow and grow. The units were in shambles, contents scattered and forgotten. A couple of stores still had some merchandise on their shelves. It was a trip to see in the dark. I remember stumbling upon a wedding gown and tuxedo laid out side by side in one of the rooms. It definitely didn't belong there. It looked so out of place, like a mockery of what it once might have been a celebration, now abandoned and decaying. They both looked super old, like they were forgotten by time. The strangest discovery, though, was a pile of empty bullet casings scattered across the floor, brass gleaming ominously across our flashlight's beams. They were all one size, all in one place. We didn't linger on them for very long. Our attention was soon drawn to something else. There weren't any holes in the walls, so we didn't know what they'd been shooting at. It looks like somebody had made their last stand here, Derek said. The shells leading up a hall a few steps, like they were shooting as they walked backwards. Super weird. Figured Derek was just making stuff up to impress his girlfriend. As we looked over the evidence of his weird theory, we heard something that nobody wanted to hear. It started as a strange noise, a sound somewhere between a cough and a scream. It echoed out through the dark corridor, making all the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Of course, I would come along and something like this would happen. We all froze, with our breaths catching up in our throats. From the corner of my eye, I saw something dart from one room to another. It was quick, just like a fleeting shadow, but it was enough to send our group into a collective panic. I couldn't believe it, and before I knew it, the rest of the group had retreated down the hall. I turned around and they were all already running around the corner, leaving me behind. Meanwhile, whatever lurked down that hallway was making this hacking noise. "Run!" Dylan shouted. I turned to sprint and catch up behind them, but the building seemed to close in around me. The flashlight beam flickering erratically as I ran, casting these long, twisting shadows that almost seemed to chase after me. The darkness swallowed the corners of the room, making every turn feel like a leap into the unknown. I could see Dylan and the others just ahead of me, but my poor taste in shoes prevented me from being able to catch up. I barreled through one particularly wrecked room. A sharp, searing pain shot through my foot. I stumbled and looked down. My heart was sinking. There, sticking out of my big toe, was like this grotesque trophy, a syringe. The needle had gone in long ways, piercing through the entire length of my toe, lodging itself painfully in the flesh of my foot. I couldn't move my toe, the metal shaft holding it rigid. I instantly went into shock, collapsing to the floor and pretty much going numb. I wanted to scream, but found I could hardly even breathe. I was hyperventilating to an extreme. Would it become infected? Could I get a blood disease? I wrote myself off as dead the moment it broke my skin. "Help! Help!" I screamed, my voice echoing through the abandoned mall. The agony was overwhelming, a hot pulsing throb that made it hard to think. Then Dylan was at my side in an instant, his face pale but determined. "Hold still," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He carefully pulled out that syringe, as I gasped as the pain intensified momentarily before slowly subsiding. My foot felt like it was on fire. The terror of the situation was almost more than I could even bear. The others appeared over his shoulder. Gary and Dylan gathered me up and helped me further down the hallway. Further behind us, though, we could hear that scraping sound of whatever it was that had put us on the run. The boys took turns carrying me back to the car. It was mostly Gary and Dylan, but Derek had to take a shift as well. My body just wouldn't operate on its own. My foot was literally DOA. Every step was a jarring reminder of the pain, and I could hear the slow shuffling behind us. This sinister presence moving throughout the darkness. Never fully visible, but always there. Nobody actually saw what it was, but it was always just a few steps behind. We burst into the cool night air, my cries of pain cutting through the quiet. They loaded me up and everybody piled in behind. Gary floored it and we sped away from that strip mall, leaving that unsettling gloom behind. The drive to the hospital was a blur of agony and fear. We peeled in and did the same song and dance to get me inside. The emergency room treated me for infections that I probably had. The nights following were filled with a haze of antibiotics and regret. I remember having an awful fever for a while. The nurses suspected I was going through a drug trip or something. Dylan stayed by my side through it all though. Despite the horror of the night, he was my rock, offering comfort and support. He was super apologetic for taking me out there, and I was grateful for his presence. And in this odd twist of fate, we ended up dating after the whole ordeal. It was a strange kind of solace in the wake of such a terrifying experience. Exactly what I wanted, I guess. To this day, I regret ever stepping foot inside that forsaken place. The thrill of urban exploration had a high price, and I paid for it in pain and fear. Also, medical bills. I had to work all summer to pay them back. The mall remained a silent witness to our intrusion, its secrets untouched and its shadows unlit. Whatever creep that we encountered there ran us off and did a good job of it. While I left with a punctured toe and a new perspective, I was left with a chilling reminder as well. Some places are just better left undisturbed.